these quasi-experimental strategies. So again, going to sound very familiar to some of the stuff we talked about with experimental strategies. However, we're going to add some things in that I kind of didn't talk about back then that we're going to talk about now, just so that we didn't have that overlap. So when we're talking about one type of between subjects design, it's a post-test only design. Now we touched on it briefly, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail here. So post-test only, it's going to compare two non-equivalent groups. So here we have two groups, and again, because we're talking about quasi-experimental designs, they're naturally existing, pre-existing groups. And they only get one test after, but we're comparing those scores in those two groups. So one group is observed after a treatment or intervention, and the other group serves as a control group. And we're going to compare those post-test scores between this treatment group and this non-equivalent group. So here's an example for that. Mrs. Marshall is a music teacher, and maybe she has two different band periods. She wants to see if a computer software program will improve their compositional skills. So she implements the computer software program in one class, but not in another. And then she compares their compositional skills. So these are pre-existing groups, so they're non-equivalent groups. There was no randomization. One group gets the computer software program, one group does not, and then she compares their post-test scores, which are their compositional skills. So that study that we just described is out of within or between subject design. I'm just going to kind of ignore this question. This hint goes to the question below. So we had two groups. We were comparing their scores between subjects. And obviously the title when we started off also said between subjects, but I'm just trying to get you to think back. So what were some of the problems with the design? This is where this hint, think about the threats to internal validity, comes into play. Think about back in chapter 8 when we talked about those threats to internal validity. What were we talking about? There were two types of differences that could come into play that could affect that internal validity when we're comparing those groups. We had our individual differences, and we had our environmental differences, yes. But here it could be worse because we have the potential for confounding variables, right? More because we have these non-equivalent groups. All right, so another type of between subject design is a pre-test, post-test design. So here we're going to again compare two non-equivalent groups. They're both going to be pre-tested on the dependent variable, given a treatment, and then post-test on the dependent variable. And what we're looking at here is this change in this dependent variable. How did this change in this dependent variable occur based on the treatment? And then we also want to compare it to a control group. So it's an attempt to limit those threats to internal validity a little bit by using this change in that dependent variable at pretest and post-test. So here again we have two groups of individuals. Both are pre-tested and post-tested. One undergoes a treatment, so they have the pre-test, they undergo some sort of treatment, and then they get a post-test. The other one acts as our non-equivalent control group. And again, we're comparing that change in scores for this non-equivalent group compared to the treatment group. So let's think again. We could take that study talking about fractions, and we could see how can we make that into, we talked about it being a post-test before, but how can we make it into a pre-test, post-test? Well, actually, that was kind of the example in the very beginning of the lecture, right? So in order to make it pre-test, post-test, we have our group of third graders in one class, and they're going to be taught one fraction method, and we give them a test before, and then we give them a test after. We have another classroom, they're taught fractions with a different method. They're also given a pretest before and a pretest after. So they get tested before, they learn how to solve fractions using one method, and then they're given a post-test. The other group, given a pretest before, taught to solve fractions using a different method, and then they're given a post-test as well. And then again, we can compare that change in scores. And remember, so we're talking about them here in terms of these quasi-experimental designs because these are non-equivalent groups and they're natural or pre-existing, but those designs can also be used in our true experimental research. So Was that a within or between subjects design? It was between. We're still talking about those between subjects designs underneath that quasi-experimental strategy. So again, what types of problems might we have with the design? So again, those threats to internal validity that we're talking about. What were those differences? We had our individual differences and our environmental differences. But now we're doing a pretest and a post-test. So what does that add into as a threat to our internal validity? Even though, using this pretest post-test helps control a little bit for some of these individual and environmental differences, but now that we're measuring before and after, we're adding in which one of those variables we talked about for within subjects design. Those time-related influences. So here again, I'm just kind of hit home that this is that idea of non-equivalent groups. So in particular, history, right? So what happens during that time period? So maybe what happens in one classroom is different than another classroom. Maybe in one classroom, maybe the teacher is sick for a while, so they have a sub. That could change the outcome. Maybe the sub doesn't know how to teach that new fraction method. So in particular, when you have different histories between different groups, that's called the differential history effect. Sorry about that. I will try to edit that out if I can. Otherwise, carrying on, do you remember some of the other time-related effects we talked about? Maturation, instrumentation, testing effects, and regression towards the mean. So again, all of those could have more of an effect because we have our non-equivalent groups. So yes, as I mentioned before, they're called differential effects. Those different histories between those different groups are called differential effects.